Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 6, Surveys and Observations, which will be particularly important for your survey project that we'll be completing in this part of the semester. Now, for our purposes in this class, we're going to take survey and poll to mean the same thing. So in terms of your reading of the text and in any test questions, survey and poll will mean the same thing for us. So there are two major challenges with creating a survey. And survey research, let me just explain first, is self-report methodology. So a survey is typically could be a questionnaire where people write down their answers to questions. Could also be an interview where you go and actually personally interview people, but you're asking people questions about themselves. Therefore, we're talking about a self-report type of method. And the two major challenges are, number one, the judgment phase of survey research, and that is ensuring that participants are thinking about the same question that the researcher was thinking about. And the response translation phase, this is ensuring that participants are able to translate how they're feeling inside to some kind of value on a scale. So when we talk about the judgment phase, we're talking about writing questions clearly so that what you write as a question and what you're meaning as your question is exactly the same that the participant is the same way that the participant is understanding the question. This means very clear questions using operational definitions so that your thought about what you're asking and the way that the reader is reading the question is exactly the same. And you know this from sending emails and texts and things like that. You write something that's perfectly clear, and then someone writes you back and is like, what did you mean by that? Same thing on a survey. You need to be even more clear and exact with what your question is so that the person who's reading it understands exactly what you mean. The response translation phase has to do with response choices, that everybody has a place to put their answer, and that you've covered all the possible choices. For example, if you had a question about relationship status and you put married or divorced as the two choices, well, you know there are lots of other potential options: single, dating, widow, and if those choices aren't there, people don't have a place to put their answer. And so as you're coming up with response choices, you need to be sure that there are places and answers that allow everybody to answer the question. When you're talking about the kind of question you want to ask, there are many different types. An open-ended question is just kind of like an essay question. For an example, what do you think of this class, with an empty space and people just write their responses. We have a Likert scale option. This is on a scale of 1 to 5, or it could be 1 to 10, doesn't matter what the numbers are, but on some kind of a numeric scale. How difficult is this class, with 1 in this case being easy and 5 being hard, and people circle their answer. Forced choice, this gives people two choices. Do you like this class so far, yes or no? And we're not going to cover semantic differential format in this class or on the exam. Each of these have pros and cons. There is no 100% right or wrong way to write a question. Open-ended questions, pros is that you get a lot of information, very detailed information, perhaps things you weren't even thinking about, but you get those kinds of answers in a very detailed way, which is nice. Negatives to open-ended questions, number one is it's hard for people to answer them. People don't love writing a bunch of answers. You could imagine taking like an essay test with 10 or 20 essay questions. People don't usually like that. They're more apt to not take your survey if it's filled with a lot of open-ended questions. And it's also a little harder to figure out how to analyze your data, because you've got to take that essay question answer and somehow turn it into something you can statistically analyze. Forced choice format, the difficulty here is that you're giving people two options, and what if they don't fit into one of those options? Do you like this class so far, yes or no? Well, what if the answer is maybe? That's not an option here. Likert scale, sometimes it's hard to figure out where people reside. Their answer should be on a scale like this. But it's often a very useful measurement scale. When we talk about writing questions well, we're talking about using very clear operational definitions, and we talked about operational definitions earlier in the class, meaning you're taking your abstract construct and turning it into something clear and objective. So if you had a question, how many drinks do you have every day? That is very vague, because what do you mean by drinks? Is it drinks of anything, or are you talking about alcoholic drinks? What is a drink? We would need an operational definition. We're talking about this many ounces of this type of liquid. So you want to have those operational definitions in your questions so people understand what you're asking them. This is where it may seem like you're giving too much information, or your questions may seem more wordy, but it's more important that your questions are clearly written. So operational definitions are extremely important. Some do's and don'ts for wording questions well. Do's, keep your questions as simple as you can and use informal language. This is not the time to show your very exceptional vocabulary or make very complicated questions. You want everybody to be able to read and understand the question, and so keeping it simple and using vocabulary that everyone can understand is a key. Make sure the questions are relevant to everyone in the study, right? If you ask a question, how much time do you spend a week with your sister? And some people don't have sisters. Well, then there has to be either that question has to be changed in some way so that it applies to everyone, or there has to be an answer so that you can write does not apply. Establish a judgmental context. What is the question in relation to? So this is basically on your Likert scales. If you have a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you enjoy Psych 301? Well, you need to tell people what does a 1 stand for and what does a 10 stand for. Ease into socially sensitive questions. You just approach a survey very much like a conversation, meeting someone for the first time. You don't usually start with really personal, sensitive questions. These two points actually go together right in the beginning. You typically start with more questions that are easier to answer. How old are you? Are you a student? Things like that. And then ease into more sensitive topics and then ask the questions in a sensitive way. Guarantee participants' anonymity. This is part of our ethical guidelines, which we will still talk about in this class, about being sure that participants know their name and their identity is not associated with their answers. You're more apt to get honest answers if you let people and you guarantee their anonymity. Often psychologists are interested in very personal topics. We ask about their alcohol use, their illicit drug use. We have all sorts of questions, research topics that we're interested in that are very, very sensitive. And if people think that their name will be associated with their answers, they will not be as honest. So anonymity is key. Wording questions well, things not to do. You want to avoid negations. They're confusing. You can see a question like this. People who do not drive with a suspended license should never be punished. What does that mean, right? There's too many nots. I am never unhappy to go to school. Well, never unhappy, that means I am happy to go to school. So just write that. And then you have disagree and agree. So it's when you use a lot of don'ts, that makes the questions hard to understand. Avoid double-barreled questions. So A double-barreled question would be something like this: I love my mother and my father. Double-barreled question is answering two or asking two questions in one. And that's a problem because how do you answer true, false? I love my mother and my father. Well, maybe you love your mother and not your father, or your father and not your mother. It's two questions in one. Or I love swimming and wearing sunscreen. Again, this should be broken into two questions. My children certainly wouldn't be able to answer this because they love swimming and they really dislike wearing sunscreen. Avoid forced choice items if you can, where there's only two options. Do you prefer steak or chicken? Well, you can probably see the problem there. What if someone's a vegetarian? Well, they can't really answer that question. And avoid questions that don't yield any variance. When we do statistics, we're looking for variability. We're looking for why people answer the questions differently. And so if everyone answers a question the same, then there's nothing to look at. So a question like, I am opposed to murder, yes or no? I'm going to guess most people would say yes. And then there's nothing to look at. So you want to be sure your questions yield variability and be thinking about floor effects. This is when everyone has a low response. We mean on the floor, very low. So if you give someone a test or a group of people that a test that's too hard and everyone gets a low score, well, that doesn't tell us anything, right? If in Psych 301, I give all of you a calculus test for our final and everybody gets a 0 because that's too hard and not what we studied, that doesn't tell me anything about what you know about research methods. That would be a floor effect. And a ceiling effect is a test that's too high. Everyone gets a very high score. They score on the ceiling, we would say. If I gave a test in this class for our final that was, I don't know, like a second grade math test, which had addition and subtraction on it, most of you would get 100. And again, that doesn't tell me anything about how much you know about Psych 301. We need tests where there is variability in our scores. And avoid biased and loaded questions. You want to write your questions in a very non-biased, objective way. Because if you ask your questions in a biased way, again, people may not give you their honest answer. So something like, you don't drink any alcohol, do you? That's a biased way of asking that question as opposed to how many alcoholic drinks do you have per day? Something like that. I'm going to skip this would be an example, but we're going to move on. Response translation phase, this has the idea of how do you choose the response scale that you're going to use for your survey. If you're doing a Likert scale, we usually do about 3 to 10 options as a rule of thumb. For example, how satisfied are you with your life right now? If you only have 2 choices, 1 is not at all and 2 is extremely, well, that doesn't give people enough options to kind of put where they truly feel. But how satisfied are you with your life right now from 1 to 23? That's too many options, right? I don't know. Am I an 18 or a 19 or a 20? It's hard to answer. So usually we do about 5 to 7 as our typical response choices. Also important to give anchors to your response choices, meaning you're giving meaning to the scales. What do this in this case of how satisfied are you with your life right now, what does a 1 versus a 5 mean? And it also matters what you put there. Does a 1 for how satisfied are you with your life right now, does a 1 mean not at all or not very much? That really changes what the 1 means. So it's important what you write there. And if 5 is extremely satisfied versus completely satisfied, again, that changes what that 5 means. So you want to give these anchors and be sure that you are and be sure you understand and choose anchors that are what you want in terms of how people answer the questions. Also, you want to create equal appearing intervals between points on your scale. So it's easier to learn in lab rather than lecture classes. And if I have 1 being strongly disagree, 2 is disagree, 3 is no opinion, 4 is agree, and 5 is strongly agree, it appears we have equal intervals between these points on our scale. Versus if a 1 was very strongly disagree, 2 is strongly disagree, 3 is disagree, 4 is no opinion, and 5 is very strongly agree. You see how this jump from 4 to 5 seems like a much bigger distance than maybe from this point of 1 to 2. So you want to be sure you're keeping equal appearing intervals on your scale. Encouraging accurate responses. You want people to give accurate responses. Of course, there's always the chance that people will mislead you purposefully or non-purposefully on their self-report surveys. Sometimes people use shortcuts. They may or may not know they're doing so, and this is sometimes called a response set. That means people sort of answer questions the same way. Some people are more of an acquiescence kind of response style, a yay saying. These are people who agree to everything. They don't really read the questions. They just, it looks like that's what's happening here. Whatever the answer is, whatever the question is, they're just answering, I very strongly agree. Just kind of a shortcut for answering the questions. A fence-sitting type of response set would be answering right down the middle, 3s on everything. Kind of providing a neutral response. And you also can have people who are more disagreeable and want to disagree with everything. So if you look through a questionnaire and you just see everything is agree, 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 that might be cause for concern on in terms of if the answers are valid. Lots of surveys actually provide ways, and they write the questions in such a way that you can make an actual judgment as to whether people are using one of these response sets or if they are telling the truth. That would be you'd learn more about that in a testing and measurement type of class. And certainly on our surveys that we're doing in here, there's not much that we can do. We just have to take their answers for what they are. Also encouraging accurate responses. You might have a social desirability response, people faking good. People like to think that they're, and like others to think good things about them. And so they're more likely to fake good, like how many times do you exercise a day? Be hard for someone to write 0, or a week, let's say, how many times you exercise a week. People might try to justify a higher answer like, I'm gonna write 5 because, I go to school and I have to park and then walk to my car and walk to my class, and that's kind of exercise, so I'll say 5. How can we minimize that is by making our questionnaires anonymous so that it's not really associated with their name. Some people also fake bad. They want to look like they need help, they need therapy, they need medication, they need people to take care of them. There's all sorts of reasons why people might fake bad, where when you ask questions, they just answer it the worst. How much anxiety are you having? All the time. How depressed are you? Extremely. So you can see it either way. And you can read in your book about self-reporting more than they can know and self-reporting memory of events. It's hard. Memories are hard to often remember. And more than they can know, you want to look at the question that you're creating and think if you could answer that yourself. Sometimes we ask questions that we want to ask, or try to create a question that we'd like the answer to, but our participants may not be able to answer that question. And so you want to be careful what types of questions you ask. For example, if I were to say to you, how many hours a day are you on social media? I don't know if you could answer that question. Do you have, I know now there are some phones that have apps that tell you that, but if you didn't have that app, do you keep track of how many minutes you're on social media a day. Like, oh, I was just on checking it for 30 seconds. Oh, now I checked it for a minute. I don't know. Could you get that type of answer versus something like social media is very important to me, or uh, I check my social media account at least 4 times a day, or something like that. Observational research, this would be like the cell phone study. Some claims are based on observational data. What's important there? Well, we need to be sure we have good construct validity. How are you thinking of the construct of the variables in the study? So, for example, safe and risky crossing. How do you think our operational definitions were in terms of being valid measures of safe and risky crossing? You really want to be sure you have very good, very detailed definitions so that you're clear when you mark someone as a safe crosser, they really were a safe crosser. And when you mark someone as a risky crosser, they really were a risky crosser. Same with texting and non-texting, right? Did you like our definitions and how we measured it? I think they were it was perhaps difficult to tell if someone was texting or not. And in a different study, could there be a better way to operationalize those definitions? That's very important for observational research. In observational research, definitely training is very important, a clear coding system. Also very important, how are we defining these different terms? And then a masked or a blind design is important in that observers don't know the condition the participant's in, and they don't know what the study is about. So you just have your raters or observers not knowing what group the participant is in. Are they in maybe a patient group or not patient group, or a treatment group and or not treatment group? They're not really aware of what the goal of the study is, and so they are just giving their absolute most unbiased judgment. We want to make sure that the observations are reliable and valid as well. Observer bias or effects is when observers see what they expect to see, or their expectations actually affect the participant's behavior in some way. These could be subtle nonverbal cues from the observer that actually affects the way that the participants respond. And so we have to be very careful about observer bias and observer effects by trying to, again, make the observers blind or masked to what is going on. Reactivity is also a problem in observational studies in that participants react to being watched. They change their behavior. And so how do we deal with that? Well, we could try to use unobtrusive observations, meaning where participants don't even know that they're being observed. So you can see here we've got someone looking through a one-way mirror. And so that's a very unobtrusive way, particularly with children who aren't yet familiar with the idea of a one-way mirror, or blending in to the surroundings, taking measurements like you were doing for the cell phone study at an intersection where people didn't even know they were being observed. So that's great. Solution 2 is wait it out, meaning that over time, people's reactivity decreases. So initially, when people know they're being observed in a research study, they may change their behavior, but over time, they tend to go back to their regular behavior. So waiting it out, like for instance, in my research studies, we would often take half an hour or 20 minutes when we first had our participant in our research study and just talk to them, ask them questions that were really not part of the study, but just to get them comfortable and to relax and to kind of start acting in their more typical way. And then after half an hour, we would go on with our research study, hoping that we will have gotten rid of some of the reactivity to first being in a research study. And if those are not options, solution 3 is measure the behavior's results. Maybe you can actually measure the behavior without significant issues with reactivity. Like I want to observe how much junk food somebody eats, and so I'm going to go observe them in their, do a home observation or maybe a home observation. Well, when you have someone watching you at home, and they know they're in an eating study, well, they're probably not going to eat much junk food in front of the researcher. But maybe if in terms of measuring the behavior's results, you're looking at going through their trash. And of course, you would need all sorts of ethical approval and let them know you're collecting trash at certain houses. And then you would look for signs of that behavior, like bags of chips and empty bags of cookies and things like that. Is it ethical for researchers to observe the behavior of others? That is a good question. It depends. If something is happening out in public, like watching people cross the street, that is ethical to observe. You certainly cannot do anything to change what's going on around you without getting some kind of ethical or approval by the institution you're doing the research at. We'll talk about that when we get to our ethics chapter. But basically, you can observe what's going on publicly. Can you go look in people's windows without them knowing? Absolutely not. You can't change anything. Is someone going to stumble over a big rock that I put in the middle of the sidewalk while they're texting? I can't do that. I can't put a rock there just on my own, but for an observational study. But if I'm just kind of looking at what's happening in the environment, that is generally ethical. Other issues for measuring behavior, we can ask other people. So instead of just a self-report, we can also ask parents, particularly if we're talking about children, teachers, a partner, someone at work. Again, you would need to get someone's consent to administer some kind of survey or questionnaire to other people in that participant's life, but often that's very helpful. Like again, with child research, we often do self-report questionnaires, maybe about their own behavior. But then we ask parents and teachers as well, and we try to get a better understanding of the child's behavior. We can also use psychophysiological measures. So we have talked about this also, measuring heart rate, endocrine like cortisol and different hormones, MRI, fMRI, neurotransmitters, eye tracking, all sorts of other ways so that you're not just relying on someone's report. You can also look at some maybe measurements that seem a little less potentially subjective. And that is it for this chapter. Thank you.